Hi, and welcome to On the Economy. Today, I'm very fortunate to have with me Michael Grunwald, an author who wrote a really important, great new book called The New Deal. This is getting a lot of great attention, as it should. This is about the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act, or the Recovery Act, something I myself was intimately involved with and write a lot about on my blog. So I was particularly happy to get Michael here today to talk more about it. Let's just start out with broadly, Michael, saying, just kind of tell the viewers what the book is about, and maybe say a couple of words about what your experience has been so far in talking about this. Obviously, one of the themes of the book is that the Recovery Act isn't the most popular piece of legislation in legislative history, and I think your view is actually quite positive. So just hold forth a little bit on the overview.
Sure. I mean, I guess the quick response is that just about everything people know about the stimulus is wrong. And you ask how I live in South Beach now. I spent a long time at the Washington Post, so I know Washington, but I'm not sure I could have written this book if I still lived in D.C., because the groupthink here is so powerful. And in Washington, really, the Recovery Act, the stimulus, is considered just a big pathetic joke.
I mean, when I'm writing these days, I actually kind of try to avoid the word stimulus because I know it's that dog whistle.
I've noticed.
Well, I talk about jobs measures, and I mean, it's not like I'm not talking about the Keynesian stuff, but avoiding that word.
President doesn't use the word either.
Well, there you go. There you go.
Because it does have this, it's become toxic.
Yet the reaction to your book has been anything but toxic.
Well, it's been very gratifying, obviously, and I do think, maybe just the sort of sheer mass of it. I don't know. It sort of said like, well, this guy clearly has at least looked at this, and and I really have, and I think, there's the notion that Washington could have gotten something completely wrong, I think is not it's not entirely foreign to people. So I think that's certainly part of maybe what's driving people to at least take a look. And then I hope, people are reading it and saying, oh, I had no idea that, that the Recovery Act seemed to work as well as it did. I had no idea that it included $90 billion for clean energy and health IT and race to the top and all this long-term reinvestment stuff that just has been completely overlooked in the press.
Well, let's talk about that. That's been completely overlooked in the press, as you said. And you've, before this, you had a history of writing about energy and the need for much better, I think, national policy in that regard. And I found some of the details on that part to be elucidating, and I was pretty ensconced in all this stuff. Talk a little bit about the energy investments from the perspective of structural investments. Obviously, a lot of what you're doing in a Keynesian stimulus is cyclical, but the way you talk about some of this stuff is more structural, the idea of changing the way we do energy policy here in the longer term.
Right. Well, what I would say is that the Recovery Act was really the purest distillation of what Obama meant by change. Mm-hmm. He had, during his campaign, he had laid out essentially 4 areas of the economy that he wanted to change, and those were education, healthcare, energy, and then the sort of the structure of the economy, where you talk about research and infrastructure and the tax code. And energy ended up really being the big one in terms of the sort of long-term reinvestment stuff. I mean, there was $90 billion, which leveraged another $100 billion. When I first saw that, I thought it must be a typo.
Let's be clear. $90 billion in the act, leveraging from outside lenders another 100.
Exactly. This is from private capital. When in 2008. There was no private capital.
Can I give
for
one
clean
anecdote
industry.
just to amplify that?
You can give as many as you want, Jared.
We were, and I actually wanted to get into some of the minutiae that you cover so well. We were down, I was with the vice president, we were down at a factory in, I think it was in North Carolina, that made LED lighting.
Right.
And they had been a recipient of the 48C Clean Energy Manufacturing Tax Credit. CRE, exactly. A 30%, that's the name of the company. A 30% tax credit for those who made the kind of equipment that provided clean energy. In this case, LED lighting. And one of the things I vividly remember the CEO telling us was that once they got the tax credit, private capital came in to supplement that credit, and helped him expand in ways that he wouldn't have been able to otherwise.
And there was also, on the flip side, the sort of requirement that a lot of these grants, that you had to raise the private capital to get the public money. That sort of made it so that you had to have a certain credibility with the private sector to get the public money. But in any case, this was clearly the largest energy bill in the history of the country. And when you look at it, there was sort of orders of magnitude increases for things like renewables, wind, solar, geothermal, for energy efficiency in every imaginable form, low-income homes, public housing, hospitals, in factories, commercial buildings, you name it. The smart grid, clean coal, electric vehicles, the factories to build all this green stuff in the U.S. And this was clearly kind of a game-changing stuff. And
now, can you tell us any way in which some of that stuff is, or you believe will have lasting impacts?
Sure. I mean, particularly for like renewables is the obvious one, where it was really dead in the water in 2008, and the Recovery Act has really kind of gotten it off the ground, where it's doubled wind power, it's increased solar power 6 times, and it's also started to bring these things down the cost curve so that eventually they'll be able to compete. Solar already can compete in California. It's cheaper to put solar on. To get a solar panel on your roof, you can buy a 20-year contract and you'll reduce your electricity bill. So I think the battery industry is a perfect example where you'll hear a lot of complaints about A123, and some of these companies are going to go down. They're going to be losers. But essentially you've created an industry that's 30 factories where you didn't have any before, and this is going to provide a domestic battery industry for electric vehicles, and without it, these are pretty heavy equipment that you can't really have an electric vehicle industry here without it. And if you don't have an electric vehicle industry, you really may not be competing in the future.
Now, somehow we've managed not to invoke the word job so far in our discussion, and that's right. Obviously something we want to correct. I mean, you write about the Recovery Act as a success in terms of hitting some jobs targets. Say a little bit about that, but before this gets into too much of a love fest, also say ways in which we got that wrong.
Well, there was some idiot who wrote some report. I don't remember.
Okay, thank you for joining us. Sorry.
Well, look, I think you'd probably like to have that 8% prediction back, and it provided a talking point. As you know, I don't think that was sort of dispositive. I think Republicans were going to jump on this.
That was the consensus forecast at the time.
Exactly, yeah, and you got the delta right. Although we can put that on your tombstone.
Right. In other words, while the unemployment forecast was obviously too optimistic, the delta, meaning the difference between where unemployment actually ended up and where it would have ended up otherwise, we arguably got that right.
Well, I think people don't understand. What I always say is that the financial earthquake had hit, but the economic tsunami hadn't hit the shore, and so it wasn't like where FDR came in after 2 years of a depression. Everybody knew things were bad. They knew whose fault it was. The fourth quarter of 2008, now as you know, the initial jobs number said, 4% decline in GDP, which is horrific. But the actual, it was later revised to a negative 9% GDP. At that rate, you're going to lose the entire Canadian economy in a year. It was just, you were essentially in a depression. And so I think part of the problem when you ask, why don't people appreciate this thing, is that it was a jobs bill passed while jobs were hemorrhaging. And no amount of stimulus, as you said, could have dealt with, 8 million jobs whole, in the few months before people were going to start judging it.
One final question, and in a way it gets to this issue of how the stimulus, the Recovery Act has been so discredited in so many different circles, despite the fact that, as you document in great detail, that's just not at all accurate. You would think that regardless of your political persuasion, Republican, Democrat, conservative, liberal, that growth is really important, especially when you're in the midst of the greatest recession since the Great Depression. And in fact, I vividly remember, and you can see this to this day, when there were days when it looked like the Recovery Act was going to be larger than the markets thought, the markets reacted very positively. So why is it, in your view, that something that clearly contributed to a better economic outcome than would have happened otherwise, something that I would think anyone, including elected officials, would feel good about, ended up getting beat up so bad. Is it pure politics?
Well, the short answer is read the book. The longer answer, look, in 2008 there was the Bush stimulus passed no problem. In every
point.
Presidential candidate had a stimulus plan. The largest was in 2008. The largest was some guy named Mitt Romney, who you might have heard of.
Right.
And
$250 billion, as I recall.
It was $250 billion. That's exactly right. And then, while the Recovery Act was being debated in the House, for example, Republicans, almost all of them voted, including a guy named Paul Ryan, who you might have heard of, voted for a $715 billion stimulus that was made up of tax cuts and spending. It was never entirely clear why that was good public policy, while the $787 billion stimulus of tax cuts and spending was freedom-crushing socialism. Which is a long way of saying yes. I think this was politics. I document in the book that there really was a Republican plot to destroy Obama before he even took office, and there's a reason why all these things, not just Keynesian stimulus, but things like the smart grid and health IT and middle-class tax cuts that used to have bipartisan support. Something happened on January 20th, 2009 that suddenly made them very unpopular with the Republican Party. I don't know.
Yeah.
What do you
I
think
remember
it
it
could
well.
be?
Cold day in Washington. Okay, final question. Somewhere out there, I hope it's very far, is another downturn, another recession. Somebody will be president. That person will come to the table and say, hopefully, we need a Keynesian stimulus of some magnitude, because as you said, philosophically, this is still something very widely, putting the politics aside, it's very widely accepted by politicians of all stripes. We need to do another Keynesian stimulus of some magnitude to offset the downturn we face. What will that debate be like based on what we've seen with the treatment of the Recovery Act? And I know you're just speculating, but give me some speculation.
Well, I think there's some evidence that it will depend who the president is. You already see Republicans, they're still using Keynesian arguments. When you start talking about cutting defense, it's like, oh no, that's going to destroy jobs in the
Which
local
we're
economy.
Seeing, right now around this
the
automatic
fiscal
spending
cliff.
cuts.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And of course the whole argument over tax cuts, right? Like, oh, you can't raise taxes in a recession. Oh, well, why not specifically in a recession? There's some mid-century economist who I think may have talked about that. Right. So I do think, I document in this book that I think it's really the first book that's done it. I have some fly-on-the-wall discussions of when the Republicans were really planning their opposition to Obama, and it's happening in December 2008, January 2009, and they made a very smart decision. Mitch McConnell remembers that in 1984. All the Democratic senators, even people remember the Reagan landslide, the Democratic senators were reelected too. Because when times are good, nobody remembers who voted yes or no. It's only when times are bad that people are going to start blaming the incumbents. And that what he told his caucus is, if we can stand tough on this and we can say no, then if things don't immediately miraculously recover by 2010, this is our ticket back. And it was smart and it worked.
I think that the interesting policy point to pull out there, and you've reminded me of it. In fact, I wrote a blog on this recently saying that we're all Keynesians for now, or something like that, on this very point around the sequester, is in fact this really very dominant consensus when you look underneath the political surface of how Keynesian economics still very much applies in a down economy. Well, thank you very much, Michael, and please get and read this book. I'll be writing about it for weeks on the blog, but you should read it as well. Thanks for joining me.
Thanks so much, Jared.